Hi, that was a dramatization of Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour by a group of actors and narrators from Homestead High School. So far, we've discussed the elements of fiction individually, but we haven't discussed all the elements together in the context of one story. The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin is the ideal venue to do this. By now you know that there are 6 elements of fiction: character, plot, setting, narration, symbol, and theme. So how do these work in the story of an hour? As we discussed in a previous lecture, there are 4 characters in this very short story, 1 major character and 3 minor characters. Josephine, Richards, and Brentley are not well developed. They are flat and static. However, Mrs. Mallard, the protagonist, is round and arguably dynamic. She moves from being an oppressed woman to a woman so determined to be free that she would rather die than continue in her marriage. Now, often the antagonist of a story is another character, but in this case, the antagonist is actually society's view of women, and of course Mrs. Mallard is a part of that society. The plot of the story is presented in chronological order. Believing Brentley Mallard to have died in a train wreck, Richards and Josephine go to the Mallard home to break the news to Louise. After initially crying, Mrs. Mallard retires to her bedroom where she is overcome by her sense of freedom. Victorious, she walks down the stairs and sees her husband come into the door. She dies of joy that kills. The primary conflict, then, is man versus man. This is an internal conflict in which Mrs. Mallard is battling with herself about how she wants to live the rest of her life. The conflicts are internal, not external. The setting of the story is important on both the global and the local level. Globally, the setting is a time period where women's roles were heavily prescribed. Women were supposed to be domestic. Their greatest wish, supposedly, was to have a husband, a home, and children to take care of. Presumably, Mrs. Mallard bought into this. On a local level, the setting is the Mallard home. It is significant that the house has 2 floors. Typically, the lower floor of a home is considered the public space. This is where we can invite guests and have friends over. And the upper floor of a home is considered the private space. Typically, the bedrooms are there, and these are places that we don't allow just anyone to go. This fits into Mrs. Mallard's character as well. When she is downstairs, she is referred to as Mrs. Mallard, a wife. In other words, her identity is created through her husband. But when she goes upstairs, we learn that her name is Louise. Her sister refers to her as Louise. To put it another way, in private settings, her identity is personal and individual. The narration of this story is third-person limited. The narrator knows Mrs. Mallard's thoughts and feelings, but not anyone else's. And this is important because this is a story with very little dialogue. A lot of it is internal. We get a little insight into Brentley's feelings for his wife, but even that is filtered through Mrs. Mallard. Now, as far as symbols, there aren't very many symbols in this story. One, of course, is the open window, which symbolizes Mrs. Mallard's freedom. And the other is her name, Mrs. Mallard, which symbolizes her role as a wife and her lack of an individual and personal identity. Finally, the topic that is most often repeated in the story is oppression. And therefore, I would say that the theme of this story seems to be that when oppressed people experience freedom, they often go to elaborate means to avoid being imprisoned again. And in this case, Mrs. Mallard would prefer to die than to go back to an oppressive marriage. And remember, it isn't Brentley who's oppressive. She makes that very clear. It's the idea of marriage in general. A second theme, which we see in Steinbeck, Hemingway, and many others, is that moments of pure freedom are often short-lived. And that's a pretty sad message. This has been Professor George, along with students from Homestead High School, and you were listening to the 6 Elements of Fiction in the Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. Thank you for listening.